Tomorrow, March 31st, at 9:40 in the evening, the Sun in Aries forms a perfect conjunction with Black Moon Lilith, also in Aries. If that sounds like just another astrological event, you are missing the entire point. This alignment does not happen every year. This precise meeting of solar identity and the part of you that was exiled for being too real, too present, too wanting, this is rare. And it is arriving tomorrow night with the full weight of everything you have been carrying for a very long time, and you have been feeling it already, not in some abstract spiritual sense, in your body, in the specific texture of the last 2 weeks of your life. You have been waking up early, not because anything is wrong exactly, but because something is not quite right either. Somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, your eyes open and there is a pressure you cannot locate. It is not anxiety in the way you usually know anxiety. It is heavier than that and older than that. It sits in your chest or behind your sternum, and you lie there trying to name it, and the name never quite arrives. So you wait for the light to change outside your window. You go back to sleep if you are lucky. You carry the residue of it into the morning if you are not. And during the day, something else. You have been noticing yourself. Noticing yourself in a way that feels like watching from a slight distance. Watching yourself agree to something you did not fully want to agree to. Watching yourself shrink back at the exact moment you meant to move forward. Watching your own voice go quieter when it should have gone louder. And the noticing is new, not the behavior, the noticing. The behavior has been there for years, maybe decades. But this watching, this is different. Something in you is no longer willing to look away from it. Keep watching, because there is a specific reason why this particular moment, this transit, this week, this version of the reckoning you are in is happening right now and not at any other point in your life. I will explain it later. It has to do with what was buried in you and what is ready right now to surface. And once I explain it, the last several months will make a kind of sense they have not made before. But first, you are not alone in this. Not at all. Right now, thousands of people are watching this video in the same window of ours. People who have lived long enough to recognize what it feels like when the sky is not being subtle. People who have been carrying something they cannot name, waking at strange hours, watching themselves shrink, and finally, deciding they are tired of the watching without the changing. If you are here, that is you. That is what brought you to this video at this particular hour. If what I'm describing is landing, leave a comment below that says, I am done making myself smaller. Not because it is something you aspire to, because it is something you are choosing, starting now. Like this video if it reaches you. Subscribe if you want to stay in this conversation. And settle in, because what we are going to move through together in the next 40 minutes, this is not going to be a light pass. This is going to go deep. We are going inside something that has been waiting a long time for you to arrive. So, what have you actually been feeling? Not what you think you should be feeling. Not the version of yourself you report to other people. What has been happening in the interior of your days in the last 2 to 3 weeks? Because if this transit is moving through you the way it moves through most people in the space of this alignment, I think I know. And I want to name it as precisely as I can, because I suspect that what you most need right now is not explanation. What you need first is to feel that someone already knows. There is a specific kind of tiredness that does not come from too much work or too little sleep. It is a tiredness that comes from the long sustained effort of managing yourself for the sake of other people's comfort, of softening your edges before you enter rooms, of choosing careful words over honest words, because honest words tend to make things awkward, and you have learned over many years that awkward is something you are supposed to prevent. This tiredness is not in your muscles. It is in the deeper layer below muscles, in the place that has been making constant small adjustments, constant small erasures, for so long that it no longer registers them as choices. They just happen. And now something is registering. And the registering is exhausting in a completely different way than the original effort, because the original effort had a kind of numbness in it. The registering does not. The registering is awake, wide awake, and it does not let you rest the way the numbness used to. You have been more irritable than you want to be. Not dramatically, not in ways that have broken anything open, but there is a low heat just under the surface of normal interactions that was not quite there before. Someone says something mild and reasonable, and something in you responds with a flash of something you would not call anger exactly, but that is adjacent to anger. A flash of, why am I tolerating this? Not the specific interaction, the entire architecture of tolerating. And then you catch it and you smooth it back down and you are pleasant and composed because that is what you do. But the flash happened, and it is happening more frequently. And in the quieter moments when you are alone or almost alone, you notice that the flashes are not random. They are pointing at something specific, something old, something that has been waiting for exactly this level of your attention to finally say what it means. Your sleep has a texture to it right now that it does not always have. Not necessarily broken sleep, though for some of you it is broken, but even the sleep that feels complete has been leaving a residue. You wake and something was happening that you cannot fully remember, and whatever it was left a feeling behind. Sometimes the feeling is grief, clean and simple and surprising in its directness, a grief that does not attach to anything specific, that simply moves through you in the early morning before the day begins and its demands absorb you. Sometimes it is closer to longing, a reaching towards something that was present in the dream and is gone in the morning. That particular quality of morning longing for an unnamed thing, a wanting that you have been keeping at arm's length in your waking hours, that the sleep releases briefly, and then the day locks back down. And sometimes you wake, and the feeling is something that takes 20 minutes to identify, and when you identify it, you find quietly, and with some surprise, that you are angry, not at any specific person, at a pattern, at the long, patient, carefully managed accommodation of everyone else's needs, and the way that accommodation became such a habit that you cannot always tell in the moment whether you are choosing it or whether you have simply forgotten that choosing was an option. In your relationships, the close ones, the long ones, there has been a particular friction showing up. Not fights, not crises, something subtler. I sense in certain conversations that you are explaining yourself to someone who is not quite hearing the version of you that is speaking. That there is the version of you they have understood for years, and then there is the version you have been becoming quietly in the private hours, and these two versions are not fully reconciled yet, and the gap between them is making certain conversations feel like translation across a widening distance. You love these people. This is not about that. This is about the fact that when you grow, the relationships built around the older version of you feel the strain of it. The people who knew you in your smaller shape feel, somewhere in themselves, the size you are becoming. Some of them move toward it. Some of them resist it. And the ones who resist it will not always announce their resistance directly. It will arrive as subtle pressure, as a slight withdrawal of warmth, as a reaching for the version of you they recognize. And you will feel that pressure, and there will be a familiar pull to accommodate it, to return to the smaller shape, to make the friction stop. Notice the pull. You do not have to act on it. Your work, or your sense of what your work is worth, has been creating a specific discomfort. Whether you are employed or building something of your own, whether you are in the middle of a career or in the middle of deciding what the next shape of your working life should be, something about your own value has been surfacing and causing friction. Not in abstract terms, in specific terms, in the way you quoted a price and then second-guessed it before the other person even responded. In the way you noticed someone with less experience and more confidence taking up space you were equally entitled to, and something in you wanted to say something and something else in you said nothing. In the way you have been making yourself easier for other people to manage professionally and personally for so long that ease has come to feel like safety, and you are only now beginning to wonder whether it is. Whether ease, for you, has ever actually been safety, or whether it has been a longer, more patient form of contraction that you dressed up as virtue so that the contraction could continue without resistance from yourself. There is also something happening with your sense of direction. Not in the dramatic sense, not a crisis of purpose, though for some of you it is precisely that. In the quieter, more unsettling sense of having been oriented by external structures for a long time, by roles, by obligations, by the shape of what other people needed from you. And noticing now that those structures are shifting or loosening, And underneath them you find not a clear alternative direction, but a very open, very quiet, somewhat vertiginous space. The space of not yet knowing what comes next. The space that follows when you have done the thing you were supposed to do for the people you were supposed to do it for. And now there is a different question available. The question that was always there but could not be asked until you had finished answering everyone else's. What do you actually want? Not what you are willing to accept, what you actually want. That question is live right now. And it is uncomfortable in the way that live questions always are, because they require honest answers. And honest answers have consequences, and consequences require courage. And underneath all of this, underneath the tiredness and the friction and the waking at strange hours, and the watching yourself and the flash of something that is almost anger and the unnamed wanting in the early morning, there is something that is not distress. Or not only distress, there is something that is beginning, very quietly, to feel like recognition. Like a part of you that has been underground for a very long time is pressing upward toward the surface. And the pressure itself is uncomfortable, and the emergence itself is uncomfortable. But there is something in the pressure that feels true. More true than the managed version. More true than the accommodating version. More alive than anything that has come from keeping yourself small and careful and easy for everyone else to be around. That is what this transit has been building toward. And that is why, when I tell you what is happening in the sky right now, it is going to feel less like news and more like the explanation you have been waiting for. Here is what is actually happening. The sun is the most fundamental of astrological energies, not in the sense of being the most dramatic, but in the sense of being the most personal. The sun is the core question of who you are, not who you perform, not who you have agreed to be across the decades of accommodation and careful self-management. Who you actually are, what you were built to express, what you came here to embody, what has been trying to push through the surface of every moment where you held it back. When the sun is active in a transit, the central theme is always the same. Who are you when no one needs you to be anything other than that? Black Moon Lilith is different in kind. She is not a planet in the conventional sense. She is a point. The lunar apogee, the place in the moon's orbit where the moon is farthest from Earth. But she represents one of the oldest and most specific archetypal wounds in the collective human psyche. The story of what happens to the self, to any self, in any body, when it refuses to be small. Lilith was the first. Before accommodation, before the managed version of selfhood that long social training produces, Lilith refused. She said no. And for that refusal, she was exiled. Turned into a figure of danger. Made into something to fear. The mythology is not subtle because the wound it encodes is not subtle. It is the wound of having been punished for being full-sized. Here is what you need to understand about how Black Moon Lilith works in a transit. She does not govern what was taken from you. She governs what you gave away. What you learned, through punishment, through the slow accumulated message that your full-sized self was too much, to put somewhere it would not cause problems. Lilith is the part of you that was exiled not by force, but by the very reasonable calculation that exile was safer than presence. She waits until the moment in a life when the person is finally experienced enough, finally tired enough of the exile, to consider that full presence might be worth the risk. Tomorrow night the Sun and Black Moon Lilith meet in Aries, in the sign of the self, in the sign of the original impulse, the first movement, the energy that precedes strategy and nuance and consideration of everyone else's reaction. Aries does not ask whether it is convenient. Aries moves because it is alive. And moving is what being alive means. This is the conjunction of your core identity, the Sun, with the part of you that was sent underground, Lilith, in the sign that says now. Not when it is appropriate, not when others are ready, now. And here is the specific reason this is happening to you at this point in your life rather than at any other point. This is the reveal I promised in the opening. For the last several months, Saturn has been placing weight on the structures of your life, testing what was built on solid ground and what was built on the long habit of accommodation. Every place where you built a version of yourself around other people's comfort rather than your own truth has been under quiet, sustained pressure. You felt it as confusion, as fatigue, as a growing inability to pretend the old structures were still working. That was not dissolution. That was deepening. That was the roots going further down into layers of soil the surface cannot see, establishing the architecture of stability that the visible growth will depend on. The underground work, the invisible work of becoming ready, has been happening all this time below the threshold of what anyone around you could observe. And tomorrow night, when the Sun meets Lilith in Aries, the above-ground portion of the movement begins. The image that keeps returning to me when I sit with this transit is a tree. Not a young tree, a mature tree that has been alive long enough to have significant root architecture underground. Most of what makes a tree stable is invisible. The root system can extend as far underground as the visible tree extends above. You could look at this tree for years and not know what is happening below the surface. Before a tree grows upward in any significant way, before it claims the vertical space it will eventually occupy, it deepens its root system. It does not appear to be doing anything. From above, it looks like it has been standing still, but underneath the surface, it has been extending, finding water, finding stability in layers of soil that the eye cannot reach. And then, because it is alive and life moves upward when the roots are ready, it begins the visible part of the growth, the emergence into light, the claiming of vertical space, not tentatively, not apologetically. The way trees grow, with full commitment to their own becoming, that is where you are. The roots have been going down in the dark for longer than you have realized. Tomorrow night, the growth begins to become visible. So let us stay inside this for a long time, because this is where the real work is, not in the celestial mechanics, but in the interior of what is actually happening in you right now, and in the full arc of what it is asking you to move through. Something has been breaking open. You have probably been feeling it as loss, as the dissolution of a version of yourself that felt familiar, safe, known, the self that knew how to be manageable, the self that had learned all the right ways to shrink on demand and then expand only in the spaces where expansion was permitted. That version of you has been under pressure, and under pressure it has been cracking. And the cracking feels like loss, because that version of you has been with you for a very long time. In some ways it has been your primary self, the one other people have known, the one you have presented in professional contexts and intimate ones, the one that got you through decades of real life, real difficulty, real responsibility. It protected you when protection was necessary. It served a genuine purpose. You are allowed to grieve it. Grief is not weakness here. Grief is the acknowledgement that what is changing was real, even if it was not the whole truth of you. But here is what is true about the cracking that is different from collapse. When a shell breaks, it is not the thing inside that is being destroyed. The shell was never the real thing. The shell was what the real thing needed in order to survive in conditions that were not yet ready for it. The breaking of the shell is not loss. It is the readiness of the real thing to exist without the container it no longer needs. You have outgrown this version of yourself, not because it failed, but because you have grown to the point where it cannot contain what you have become. The cracking is not the sound of something breaking down. It is the sound of something breaking through. And there is a fundamental difference between those two things that your body knows, even if your mind is still deciding. The breaking open is not a single event. It is a process that has probably been underway for longer than the last few weeks, longer maybe than the last year. You can probably identify moments in the last several years when something shifted, a conversation that could not be unhad, a decision that could not be undecided, a truth you allowed yourself to see that you could not subsequently unsee. Those moments were not isolated. They were chapters of the same movement. The cracking you are feeling right now is the current chapter, the one where the process becomes undeniable, where the shell's pressure on the real thing becomes more uncomfortable than the prospect of letting the shell go. What is coming up from below the cracking is old, very old. This is important to name because when old material surfaces, old emotions, old knowing, old versions of yourself that were put away, the first instinct is to call it regression, to call it going backward. To worry that the progress of the last decade is being undone. It is not regression. What is surfacing is the material that waited. The material that your younger self was not equipped to receive, not because there was anything wrong with your younger self, but because receiving certain truths requires a degree of grounding, a density of self-knowledge, a capacity for holding complexity that only comes from having lived through enough. The grief that surfaces now is not the same grief it would have been at 35. The desire that surfaces now, the clear and unambiguous wanting that you have been keeping at a careful distance for years, is not the reckless wanting of an earlier decade. It is the mature, full-eyed, knowing desire of someone who has paid enough attention to their own life to know the difference between what they actually want and what they have been performing wanting. What is surfacing is not the past. What is surfacing is what the past prepared you to finally receive. For many people inside this transit, what is surfacing is an old version of themselves that was set aside at a specific moment. Not always identifiable, but sometimes very identifiable. A moment when being full-sized produced a consequence that was painful enough that they made a calculation. It is safer to be smaller. That moment does not have to be dramatic to have been formative. Sometimes it was a long relationship where your needs were consistently treated as inconvenient, and you learned to stop presenting them as needs and start presenting them as preferences, and then to stop presenting them at all. Sometimes it was a professional environment where the people who moved forward were the people who made themselves easy to manage, and you learned that lesson and applied it, and you were rewarded for the application, and the reward trained you. Sometimes it was a family of origin that had a very specific shape for what you were allowed to be, and you fit yourself into that shape so thoroughly over so many years that you forgot you had a different one. The wound is always some version of this story, and what is surfacing now is the pre-wound version, the version that existed before the calculation was made, the original size. And the original size is uncomfortable, not because it is bad, because it is unfamiliar, because you have been living in the contracted version long enough that the full-sized version feels like too much, too loud, too clear, too present, too direct, too visible. There is a specific quality to the discomfort that comes from beginning to inhabit your actual size after years of living smaller. It does not feel triumphant, the way you might expect. It feels vulnerable, exposed. Like the very visibility that was always the point, is also the very thing that the old part of you has been protecting against. The discomfort of the full-sized version is something you are going to have to sit with, not push through, sit with. Because there is important information in the discomfort. The discomfort is telling you exactly where the old wound still lives. It is a map, not an obstacle. There is a pattern underneath all of this that you have encountered before, in different forms at different stages of your life. It has appeared in your closest relationships as the habit of giving more than you receive and calling it love. It has appeared in your work as the habit of doing more than is required and calling it professionalism, and of staying smaller than your actual contribution and calling it humility. It has appeared in your inner life as the habit of questioning your own perceptions, second-guessing the thing you felt clearly before you let yourself feel it fully, checking it against everyone else's version of reality before you trust your own, and calling it being fair. The pattern in all its forms is the same, the consistent subordination of your own knowing, your own wanting, your own space, to the perceived needs or comfort or preferences of someone else. And you have told yourself stories about it that make it sound like virtue. The stories are not entirely untrue. Being considerate is real, being generous is real, care for other people is real and good and worth protecting, but there is a version of consideration and generosity that has your own exile built into it, that only functions by first evacuating yourself from the equation, and you have been living in that version for long enough that the exile has started to feel like home. And Lilith is here in Aries, in conjunction with the sun of who you actually are, to name the exile clearly so you can finally decide, with full awareness, whether you want to keep living there. The reason this particular transit targets this particular pattern is precise and worth understanding. Aries is the sign of the original self, not the socially constructed self, not the self shaped by long accommodation, but the self that existed before the first compromise. The self that moved on instinct and impulse and genuine want, before learning that genuine want was something to be managed. Lilith in Aries is the energy of that original self, carrying the specific wound of having been punished for its existence. And the Sun, your identity, your vitality, the core of what you are, meeting Lilith in Aries is the meeting of what you are with what you have been hiding from yourself. It is not a confrontation. It is a recognition. Two parts of the same person, standing in the same light. Perhaps for the first time in decades, the identity in between is the hardest part to describe honestly. And right now, you are in it. You are no longer the fully contracted version of yourself. The pattern has been too visible for too long to simply continue without awareness, and you are not yet the version that has learned to inhabit full-sized existence with ease and stability. You are in the space between identities. That space is genuinely disorienting. It needs to be named as exactly as I can name it, because in that space the most common response is to grab for solid ground too quickly, to reach for any available shape and call it the new self before the actual new self has had time to form. I want to speak to the disorientation directly, and I want to do it without asking you to rush through it. For you, at this stage of your life, the in-between has a specific texture that it would not have had at an earlier age. Your children, if you have them, may be grown or nearly grown, and the identity you built around care and provision and being needed in that way is shifting. The role is changing or is already changed, and the self that organized itself around the role is left standing in a newly open space where the shape of what to be next has not yet arrived. Your career, if you have had a long one, may be in a phase of transition. The question of what the second half looks like, what legacy means, what you are still trying to build versus what you are beginning to release, what the difference is between ambition and aliveness. Your body is changing in ways that are undeniable, and those changes are their own instruction in impermanence, in the limits of control, in the way that fighting what is true uses the same energy as receiving it, the same energy, with radically different outcomes. Your longest relationships have their own complexity now. The depth of long knowing and the friction of long patterns existing in the same room on the same ordinary Tuesday morning. That is the in-between. It is not abstract. It is Tuesday. It is the specific weight of this specific life at this specific moment, with all its beautiful and difficult accumulated reality. What the in-between requires is presence rather than strategy. The instinct is to strategize, to figure out the plan for who you are going to be next, so that the disorientation of not knowing can be replaced by the comfort of a clear direction. Strategy has its place, but the in-between is not the time for it. The in-between is the time for paying very close attention to what is actually present, to the rising material, to the pattern that is becoming visible, to the original size that is pressing upward from below the old shell, so that when the new shape forms, it forms from the truth of what you actually are, rather than from the urgency of wanting the disorientation to stop. Premature stabilization is the thing that sends people cycling back through the same pattern again 10 years later. A little older, a little more tired, wondering why the same wound keeps finding them. This time, you stay in the between long enough. This time, the change goes all the way down. And I need to say something about this life stage specifically, because the in-between that you are navigating right now is not the same in-between that would have been available to you at 28 or 35. It is denser and it is richer. It is denser because there is more at stake. There are people you love, structures you have built, a life with real weight and real consequence that does not accommodate easy reinvention. And it is richer because you have earned the capacity to hold the complexity. The younger version of you who set this pattern in motion did not have the tools to dismantle it, did not have the self-knowledge, the lived experience, the quiet authority that comes from having gotten things wrong and gotten things right and survived both. You have all of that now. The in-between at 50 is not a problem to be solved. It is an invitation that you are finally equipped to accept. There is something beginning to stabilize underneath all of the dissolution. Something quiet and new and entirely different in character from the stability of the old contracted self. The old stability was the stability of things held tightly in place, the stability of careful management, of constant small adjustments, of not allowing anything to be too real or too present or too wanting. That kind of stability requires continuous maintenance. It is exhausting in the specific way that all suppression is exhausting. The energy of holding down is never fully available for anything else. The new stability is different. It is the stability that comes from having looked at a truth and not been destroyed by it, from having felt the grief and the anger and the longing, and discovered that your capacity for experience is larger than your fear of experience, from having sat in the between and found, slowly and without announcement, that you are still here, intact, changed, still here. The early signs of the new stability are subtle enough that you might miss them if you are waiting for something dramatic. A decision that felt impossible last month, a conversation you could not make yourself have, a limit you could not make yourself set, a wanting you could not make yourself name out loud, suddenly feels possible. Not easy, possible. There is a difference that matters. Easy means the resistance is gone. Possible means the resistance is present and you are choosing the action anyway, and the choice feels like it comes from a deeper place than strategy, a more fundamental place, the place where the original self lives. The new self does not move without resistance. It moves in the presence of resistance, and it moves anyway. And that movement, however small and however quiet, is the beginning of everything that follows. A direction is becoming perceptible, not a destination, not a clear picture of what the fully arrived version looks like, because that picture is not available yet, and the part of you that wants to demand it is still the old self asking for the managed version of change rather than the real version. Not a plan, a direction, a sense, faint but increasingly real, of the angle at which you are oriented. The way a navigator can feel the current shift under a boat before they can see any landmark on the horizon. You are beginning to feel the current shift. The tree that has been building root architecture in the dark all this time is beginning to push upward. The growth is becoming visible, not loudly, not dramatically, the way trees grow, steadily, committed, with no particular concern for whether the growth is witnessed. You are beginning, slowly and with great honesty, to take up your actual space. And it is the most important thing you have done in years. Now, what do you actually do with all of this? Because the interior work matters enormously, but it has to translate into the texture of daily life, or it stays as insight rather than becoming change. And insight that stays as insight, however precisely named, however deeply felt, does not transform the actual pattern. Action does. Small, specific, repeated action, calibrated to this exact transit and this exact moment in your life. The first practice is what I call naming without apologizing. This is specific to the Lilith wound in a way that other practices are not. The Lilith wound shows up most consistently in speech, in the small constant hedging and softening and qualifying that people who have learned to make themselves smaller do reflexively, often without realizing. The apology before the opinion, the qualifier before the observation, the rise at the end of a statement that turns it into a question, that turns your knowing into a request for permission, the checking of the other person's face before you have even finished forming the thought. For the next 3 days, starting today, not tomorrow, not after this video ends, practice completing one sentence per conversation before you check anyone's face. One sentence said in full, without hedge or qualifier or preemptive apology. Not an aggressive sentence, not an overcompensating sentence that performs confidence rather than having it. An honest sentence said to its end. Notice the discomfort. Do not let the discomfort stop the sentence. The discomfort is the wound, and the wound heals by being present in the exact situation where it usually activates. The resistance will feel enormous the first few times. It will feel like too much, like you are being unreasonably direct, like you are about to break something. You are not breaking anything. You are practicing the size that was always yours. You are practicing being the tree above ground rather than only the tree below it. The second practice is the worth audit. It is specific to the external dimension this transit activates, because Aries is the sign of self-assertion, and this is the conjunction of the Sun with the exiled self. And one of the places this transit shows up most concretely is in the area of worth. How you price yourself. How you value your own time and knowledge and presence. Whether the external structures of your life reflect your actual value, or whether they reflect the contracted version's careful avoidance of claiming too much. Look at one area of your material life where you have been underpricing yourself. Your time, your work, your creative output, your energy, your presence in a relationship or a professional context. Just one area. Do not transform your entire relationship to worth in a 3-day window. Find one specific, locatable place where you have been charging less than the actual cost, to yourself, not to the other party, of what you give. Name the actual number or the actual boundary that your full-size self would claim. Write it down on paper, not in a digital note. Write it down with your hand, because the physical act of writing engages the body in the acknowledgement. You do not have to act on it this week, but you have to name it clearly in your own handwriting. Because the Lilith wound is maintained by the refusal to name what is actually true, by keeping the exile invisible, and the moment you name it on paper, the invisibility begins to end. Something shifts in the naming that does not shift in the thinking. The third practice is protected becoming. This one requires the most from you, because it runs directly against the habit of availability that most people in your life stage have deeply established. The habit of being reachable, useful, responsive, present for others in ways that leave very little space for the kind of encounter with yourself that this transit is calling for. You have been available to other people in specific and sustained ways for a very long time. This is not something to abandon or reverse. But within the structure of your availability, there is almost certainly a window. Perhaps early morning before others are awake, perhaps a specific pocket of the afternoon, perhaps one evening of the week, where you could be available to yourself instead. Not for productivity, not for improvement projects, not for the kind of self-development that still performs usefulness, for encounter with what is surfacing, for sitting with what is coming up and allowing it to be present without immediately trying to manage it, resolve it, or translate it into something actionable. The protected becoming practice is this. In that window, for however long you can protect it, you do not answer. You do not produce, you do not take care of anyone. You allow the between space to be present without rushing it toward an outcome. The resistance that will arise is guilt, the guilt of not being useful. The sense that this kind of attention to your own interior is a luxury rather than a necessity. That guilt is the wound speaking. The tree needs time underground before it can grow above it. This is the underground time. Protect it accordingly. Now, a few words for the signs that this transit is landing most directly. If you are an Aries, the Sun-Lilith conjunction is happening in your own sign, which means this is not a transit you can observe from a distance. It is a transit you are living in your body, in your decisions, in the way you wake in the morning and the way you fall asleep at night. The exiled part of you is not a stranger. It speaks your language, and it moves at your speed. What is being asked of you is the most difficult thing your sign is ever asked. To wait for the right movement rather than the first movement. Not passive waiting. Alive, present, root-deepening waiting. The full-sized thing that is surfacing in you needs your fire. But it also needs your accuracy, and accuracy requires a moment of stillness before the motion. If you are a Libra, this conjunction is forming directly across from your sign, creating a specific tension between your need for equilibrium and the Aries call to self-assertion that has no interest in equilibrium. Libra is where the Lilith wound most often manifests as the constant self-erasure that looks like fairness. You have been extraordinarily fair for a very long time, to everyone, except perhaps to yourself. This transit is not asking you to stop being fair. It is asking you to include yourself in the equation with the same seriousness you bring to including everyone else. If you are a Cancer, this transit is activating a square, a tense generative angle that brings to the surface what has been most carefully avoided. For Cancer, what has often been avoided is the specific anger that comes from having given care that was not reciprocated at the level at which it was offered. The caretaking wound, the way your giving was received as a natural resource rather than a chosen act. The Sun-Lilith conjunction in Aries is asking Cancer specifically to let the anger be present, not to act from it impulsively, but to stop managing it away before it has had the chance to show you exactly what it knows. The anger is information. Let it speak. And now, you stayed. 40 minutes inside something that did not offer easy answers or smooth resolutions. 40 minutes that required you to be present with the specific, unvarnished texture of your own interior life. The sleep and the anger and the watching, and the between space and the worth and the pattern and the roots that have been deepening in the dark, while the surface looked still. That is not a small act. At this stage of your life, after decades of taking care of everyone else's interior weather while managing your own, choosing to sit for 40 minutes with your own truth, that is a specific and significant act of self-fidelity. You did it. You are still here. The tree has been underground. The roots have been finding their depth in layers of soil that no one above the surface could see. The underground work is real, even when it is invisible, even when you could not feel it happening, even when the surface of your life looked like standing still. It was not standing still. You were not standing still. You were becoming the slow, underground, unhurried way that the things that last actually become. Tomorrow night, when the sun meets Lilith in Aries, you do not have to do anything ceremonial. You do not have to mark the moment with ritual or intention setting or any of the outer forms of spiritual practice. You can, if you want to. But the real thing that is being asked is simpler and more demanding than ceremony. It is simply this. For one moment tomorrow night, let yourself be the full-sized version. Not forever, not with a plan. Just for one moment, in private if you need to, let the contracted self relax its grip and let the actual size of what you are be present. Let yourself want what you want. Let yourself know what you know. Let yourself take up the space that is actually yours, not more than yours. Yours. If this landed where it was meant to land, give this video a like. Subscribe if you want to stay in this conversation, and leave a comment below that says, "I am ready to take up my space, not because you have arrived, because you are moving, and the direction is clear, the roots are ready, the ground is ready, and so, finally, after all of this, are you?"